week 8, research and information skills. This week we're looking at the question, what is relevant information? And by relevant, I mean relevant to an academic task or an assignment, etc. We'll be going over such things as essay questions again, so an analysis of those, looking at conducting a literature review. We sort of skirt over that to some extent. Moving to part 1 of the schedule for this week, looking at essay questions and their analysis. I have to defend this to some extent, I guess, because for some of you who are doing academic writing, this will be a little bit repetitive, but I find personally that without actually having anything to hang the research process on, research becomes a very abstract thing. So I kind of figure personally that you have to have a grounding, have somewhere to start. In this case, maybe I am repeating work that you have elsewhere, and for that I apologise. However, I still feel that the repetition is fairly good sport in terms of you guys becoming au fait or becoming accustomed to a process that will obviously help you in the long run. Anyway, what I want to look at briefly, and I do say briefly, is the mapping of questions, so how we make a mind map, and there's an activity coming up, but I'll talk about that shortly. Anyway, first off, I want to look at the process in which you can unpack an essay question. And if you have a look on slide 4 of this week's PowerPoint, I've put down 4 possible avenues of exploration which can help you actually ascertain what you have to do in relation to an essay question. And this doesn't just have to be about essays, it could be a report that you have to write, some other task, some other assessment criteria that you have to fulfill. Now, anyway, getting back to the point, the 4 points that I've put down, for a start, you have to identify the essay topic. And in essence, you have to have some sort of working knowledge of what you're being asked in a general way to do. The second is the focus. So, and usually the question itself will lend itself to the focus. There'll be certain words that direct you in a certain way to a specific thing. The third point is the instruction itself. So what, and by instruction I mean what you're actually being asked to do, literally. And the last one is, and sometimes a little bit more difficult, is the viewpoint. And often you're either directed in a certain way to take a certain angle or a position and argue from that perspective. Others you're given much more sort of general principles or guidelines, so you may be able to look at several viewpoints or vantage points. And for me, obviously if you get given a directive or an instruction to take a certain viewpoint, then obviously you should maintain that throughout your essay, unless you're attempting to present a counter-argument. But usually if you are given those sort of instructions, then my advice would simply be to follow it, even if it feels like sometimes that you're following the party line and may not agree with the party line. It's quite risky, obviously, if you take a different position that hasn't been part of the instructions, because it would appear that you either misunderstood the instructions or willfully didn't follow the instructions. And that could mean that you'll get penalised in some ways, because perhaps a certain vantage points covers a lot more material than, say, another, for instance, and your lecturer intended that wider view, for instance. So take note from personal experience, I should say. Now, if you have a look on slide 5, I've tried to indicate what sometimes is the implicit instructions in an essay, and sometimes this isn't always stated, and I find it kind of intriguing with this. Throughout my 2 degrees, I found that often what I was being instructed to do and what I was being told to do, say, by the lecturer in person, if I went to a lecture, for instance, or some sort of a tutorial where I was guided on a particular assessment, that a lecturer might indicate slightly different instructions or a slightly different focus than perhaps the one that appears to be intended by the question. And sometimes it's worth getting clarity on that. And it's not to say that you're necessarily writing directly for an audience, but audience counts. And if your lecturer wants or has a particular perspective, this has to be taken into account, and it has to be reflected in your work somehow. But anyway, getting back to slide 5. The key thing about essays, as I've put in the top, an essay is often set to test your critical and academic writing skills. And given that you'll be doing a lot of writing from here onwards, so throughout your undergrad and hopefully postgrad work, you'll be doing a lot of writing, as writing is often the expression used in academia, and is the mode or the currency in which ideas are are presented, transported, and exchanged. So for me, working on your writing skills in a more general sense, and like I said, perhaps it's out of the ambit of this particular unit, but I used to teach academic writing in England, and found that it was very easy to emphasise this aspect of your work, simply because you're going to be using these skills for a long period of time. Anyway, the key points that I've put here is that it's expected that you'll demonstrate a broad understanding of a topic, and obviously create some sort of analysis or an overlay of an analysis on top of that. It's expected that you can demonstrate an understanding and application, and for me that's the key here, being able to apply theories in different fields and in different real world situations. So in other words, that what was abstract becomes concrete, becomes real. And reading, research and the use of standard academic conventions, those are kind of almost mechanical skills that you achieve along the way, and you will not do well without them. If you think that doing sloppy referencing, for instance, or doing poor research, or simply not reading widely enough, for instance, that you'll get reasonable marks, I think, to be honest, you're almost deceiving yourself, because the expectation is that you will do the reading, and obviously the in-depth research to some extent. By some extent, I simply mean that depends on what the parameters are set by your lecturer, for instance. Sometimes you have projects that you have to go wider than others, but it's always good, I think, to go a little bit wider than what you've been given, because that shows some initiative, but also if you've even got a faint notion of curiosity, it's worth exploring other ideas, even at the temptation of going down wrong roads, tangents, etc. But anyway, the mechanical skills are the ones that you can learn simply by doing things like this particular unit, or by doing academic writing, for instance, and simply going through the whole process of academic work. You'll find over time that you accrue a range of skills, and you can literally kind of almost fall back on those every time you begin to do a task. The crucial thing here is that you have to take into account all three of those points, and the fact that you're being tested, both your critical mind, so to speak, and your obviously your writing skills, your expressions of arguments, etc., and ideas. Anyway, moving to slide 6, I want to look at a direct model about how you might map an essay. Now, this might seem a little bit convoluted because you'll see the mess that I create on slide 7, and it is quite a mess, although it makes sense to me, and no doubt if you did something similar it'll make sense to you. But there's 4 main things, I should say there's 3 main things that you should be looking at. First of all, if you look at the top right hand corner of slide 6, I've put a box there with simply 4 words. So topic, focus, instruction, viewpoint. They're the ones in bold, so yes, I know there's more than 4 in terms of the title up the top. Anyway, what you've got to work out is, first of all, what is the topic, what is the focus, what is the instruction and the viewpoint. Those give you a lead in to what you actually have to do. Down below is a more general thing, down the bottom right hand corner. You have to identify the implicit demands of the essay. So try and look deeper into the essay question, and work out exactly what other aspects it might be worth exploring, for instance. And in the top left-hand corner, obviously you're going to do a basic analysis, and you're going to be looking at the question, in the sense that you write an essay title out to actually suit the actual question. You circle or underline the key words, because that's going to help you on your search for information. And obviously draw lines from keywords to sub-ideas, which may correspond with some of the implicit demands of the essay. So these 3 main things that you hope to, I guess, pre-map before you do anything, are then realised, if you have a look on slide 7, in a whole matrix of different ideas that are interrelated, that, like I said, in my case, it's fairly jumbled. But anyway, if we go to the top right-hand corner of slide 7, so what's the topic? First of all, it's media convergence. And I have to say, this obviously comes from a media studies essay that I used to use in England. The focus is media consumption and production in relation to convergence. Obviously, the instructions are discuss, explain, explore, and discuss is the most general one, as I've talked about in previous lectures. And the viewpoint, convergence is a cultural shift, so looking at how convergence itself is literally becoming a cultural phenomenon, so how it's changing. Down below, I've identified some of the implicit demands that I think are relevant to the question. Reading and research, organisation, structure and presentation, engaging with the subject of new media studies, and thinking about the relationship between technology and cultural change. Now, I won't go into all the details for this particular essay question. As you can see by the words that are actually in bold that have been taken or extracted from the actual question, all of those have subcategories and points that are related to them, but they're all the main words that I felt are worth exploring. Now, some of them you'll explore in a lot more depth than others, but just for argument's sake, for instance, convergence just by itself needs some sort of definition, and then that definition needs to feed some sort of notion of cultural shift. So what does cultural shift actually mean, and how is it expressed through the media, for instance? And then, of course, you're given, almost luckily, the reference, Henry Jenkins, whose quote that is. He then is the perfect lead to find other academics working in this field. So you should be able to use him as a launch or as a spring pad to get a whole lot of other sources and references, etc., for this particular work, because there'll be people who obviously disagree with this and others who agree with it, for instance. Now, obviously, this could be done in a far neater way than I've done. Really, it's about room and trying to fit it all on a slide, but on a piece of paper, if you mapped it out, mapped an essay question out on, say, for instance, an A3 piece of paper, you could make it actually fit quite nicely, and also you could show links, so having arrows, for instance, connecting different bits of information. The beauty of this is that you can then translate this, once you've got the information, translate this into a plan or a model for your actual essay. So, for instance, you might have a paragraph just about convergence, where you introduce it, then you define it, and maybe explain it in terms of cultural shift. Equally, you might have a paragraph relating to Jenkins. What's the background of Jenkins? Why was he saying what he did? Has he written any other material on this? Has he got any evidence to support his view? Likewise, you could have probably a paragraph just on cultural shift, etc. So what I'm saying is, literally as a framework, this helps and can be transposed onto an essay structure quite easily. And so for me, it's a great starting point. Now, on slide 8, I've offered two questions. The first, is technology making us less social and less happy as a result? And the second, decriminalising marijuana is a socially responsible thing to do, discuss. Two questions that I hope, providing you have the time, that you can attempt to mind map. Obviously take as much detail as you can, pull out the key words, look at what you think is the focus, for instance. What's the instruction? What's the viewpoint, do you think, that's being suggested, possibly? And obviously the topics. And like the mess that I made on slide 7, I would hope that you will equally create some sort of matrix or a network of different ideas relating to those two questions. Now, moving on to slide 9, I'm hoping we're going to look at the importance of working with literature. So why is it important to actually begin research and, as I said earlier, reading fairly wide? The first thing is that it generates ideas about the subjects at hand. So you might start with a fairly fixed position or a point of knowledge or understanding about a particular thing, and very quickly, when you undertake reading, you find your ideas start to change. They widen. You may have one position that quickly erodes in the face of evidence to suggest that another position is far more consistent with the position you should be taking. Equally, it generates significant questions, so there may be a whole series of questions that arise from your reading. And obviously, the information you get gives you, in a practical sense, gives you the grounds for answering specific essay questions. So the more you focus your research through keywords, etc., the more likely you are to come upon sources which will help you deal with a question, for instance. In the most general terms, on slide 10, I simply suggest that obviously reading widely, for instance, it will increase your breadth of knowledge of a subject area. So the more you read, the more you'll know about it, in simple terms. Obviously, it identifies scholars and practitioners in a particular area, which is important, particularly when you're trying to work out who said what and why. And the last is the fact that it identifies the seminal works in your area or in a particular area. So whatever you're researching, you'll quickly find that there's certain works that certain scholars have done that actually are seen to be seminal, that are seen to be the groundbreaking or seen to be fundamental texts to a particular theory or body of knowledge, etc. Now, on slide 11, I look at the specific terms, which for me are things like it determines what is known about a subject, concept, or problem. So the more you read in terms of your research, another important aspect is that the more you read, you understand where the gaps or consistencies or inconsistencies are in a subject. And in some respects, this helps you not only answer a question, perhaps, if you are looking for gaps, but also might lead you to undertake research. So you kind of find an area that, for the most part, has been neglected, perhaps, and you begin to conceive of and devise maybe a research project, for instance. The other is that obviously you discover unanswered questions about a subject, which I think again is crucial. And the last one, obviously, the strengths and weaknesses around methodology. In other words, how people underwent studies, for instance, what methods they use to collect their data, and whether these are consistent with a particular discipline, whether they actually are logical, and obviously that they make sense in terms of the data they collected. Now, if we move on to slide 12 and beyond, I want to very briefly look at the search for information and three things that I haven't mentioned in the past. If you have a look on slide 13, despite the fact that these may be slightly obvious, and most of you should have undertaken these in some form or other, the three avenues that I want to look at very briefly is that obviously when we go searching for information, we've got a whole field available to us. But given that we have keywords and we obviously have a focus, immediately we can begin to actually concentrate our search efforts. So what we can do, in a fairly general sense, is just do a subject search. And what this involves is simply looking at all the areas of a particular subject. Fairly straightforward, I would argue. The second one is obviously keywords, and we've talked about keywords in the past, and obviously using Boolean search terms, etc. And I'm only hoping that most of you feel more comfortable with that. The other thing that I haven't probably talked much about is an author search. And while I might have touched on it in the past, I would simply tip my hat here to simply say that usually a particular author has, particularly if they're academics, they've spent quite a bit of time in a particular area. They may have written one or two articles, maybe even one or two books about a particular subject area. And their efforts have obviously gone into that. So actually it can be quite fruitful actually looking at a particular author. And obviously the key thing is that you can leapfrog from that author. You find that who he or she has referenced. So you just look at the reference section at the back of the book. You can then go searching for other authors. So before you know it, you have an army of people who are working in a particular subject area. And obviously that can give you good leads towards information that is actually going to help you obviously deal with an academic task. On slide 14, I guess as a graphic which comes from the University of Queensland of Technology, shows you a fairly succinct illustration of what the steps are in the information search process. I won't speak, too much about these things because I think they kind of lend themselves to a fairly obvious interpretations. I then move on to slide 15, where we look at, okay, what are we doing when we're working with literature? And I've put in a graphic there that comes from Leary that actually looks at the four main points. Obviously we've got to find the information, we then have to manage it, we have to use it in the context of our works, and we have to review it. And there's a whole series of flow diagrams there about what you do within each of those processes. And as far as I'm concerned, these are to be recommended with anything that you do. You may concentrate your efforts more on some than others, particularly if you look at obviously the flow aspects of each area, and some things you may feel much more comfortable with than others. But if nothing else, I think they should be considered. As I say, I've covered this search process in previous weeks, So another small point that I want to mention is on slide 16, which is about annotating sources. For me personally, I've found this incredibly helpful when I'm actually writing. And the reason it's important is that it provides obviously an ongoing record of not only where you got information from, particularly if you're writing it down somewhere, but more importantly, if you've got photocopies, for instance, it's good and it's worth taking the reference details, because you might just simply have a journal article that perhaps is only a partial script, and it's worth ensuring that you've got all the reference details there. Also, when you're annotating, and I think this is the important bit, is where it might apply in your essay. So you might, as you're reading it, you're thinking about ideas in relation to how you're going to answer a particular question, and you might even know where it might fit into a particular paragraph, for instance. But also, it may give you an opportunity in terms of annotating, may give you an opportunity to actually make comments and I guess induce further questioning, and hopefully solicit new points that perhaps you might want to explore in your essay. And obviously, through annotating, you can make direct links, literally, visually, as you write them down, towards other sources that you've actually read. All of these aspects, as far as I'm concerned, are pretty important in terms of writing, because you want, I guess, a comfortable flow, almost not a circularity to it, but a consistency, a cogency, which you've probably heard me say before, that it has a logical flow and holds together, and actually is a framework for a whole range of different sources and areas of information that you have, and that you can link the two, and that's good writing. Okay, that's probably enough for this week. I'm hoping everyone's got a moving towards their main project. You should be kind of well under the way for assignment 2. In fact, like I said, given the deadline, I would hope that most people are nearly finished that, and already beginning to look towards assignment 3, because that's the bigger one, and as far as I'm concerned, one of the most important for the unit. Okay, I hope you have a great week. All the best, Mike.